Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sacker. On December the 11th, 2.5 years of posturing, politicking and poisonous disagreement come to a head. The UK Parliament will vote on whether to accept the Brexit deal Prime Minister Theresa May has negotiated with the EU. And her case boils down to this: it is the least worst option. But many in her own party, as well as the opposition, simply don't buy it. My guest is former Government Minister Jo Johnson, who resigned in order to oppose this deal. Does he have a credible alternative? Jo Johnson, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you. Great to be here.
When you quit the government just a couple of weeks ago, you came out with this very powerful statement. You described Brexit as a failure of British statecraft on a scale unseen since the Suez crisis. Now, you have been intimately connected with the Brexit project from the very beginning. So do you feel a very deep sense of guilt?
Look, I feel we're in an appalling situation right now, and the government is presenting us with a choice which is completely unacceptable. And that's what I was referring to. It's the choice which the government is framing between the Prime Minister's deal on the one hand, which is going to trap us in this client-subordinate relationship with the EU for the foreseeable future, and then on the other hand, the threat of a chaotic exit, a no-deal exit that's going to be disastrous for our business community and lead to all manner of chaos for residents in my constituency in Orpington, because we'll see traffic backed up from the Channel ports up the M20 and along the M26. Unimaginable chaos, and that's a completely false choice for the government to present us with, and that's what I said is a failure of statecraft.
Yes, but that phrase is such a grandiose phrase that surely we can't just place all of the blame on decisions taken in the last few weeks and months. My point to you and your intimate connection is that you go back to the very beginning of this. You were one of the key architects of that Conservative manifesto when David Cameron was the leader of your party, which pledged to the British public an in-out referendum on Britain's membership of the European Union. So if we're to talk about statecraft in the widest sense, do you accept that you have to take a share of the blame?
Yes, of course. I certainly feel responsible in part for the situation the country finds itself in.
But of course, that was a mistake. The referendum decision in its origin with David Cameron, with you, was a mistake.
The origins of internal Conservative Party tensions over Europe long predate me, and they go back many decades.
Of course,
indeed,
but the fundamental decision to try to lance that boil, so to speak, by having an in-out referendum, which had been avoided for an awful long time as a proposition inside the Conservative Party, it was a decision taken by David Cameron, advised by people such as yourself. So it is interesting to me that you, on reflection, seem to be saying that was a fundamental mistake.
David Cameron took the decision to hold a referendum in January 2013 in a speech to Bloomberg at its headquarters in London, and that actually predated my arrival on the scene. But nonetheless, I certainly helped him and George Osborne put together the 2015 manifesto, on which we won a majority, and that included, as you rightly say, the commitment to hold a referendum and to implement the result. And do I think that was a mistake? No. On balance, I think holding the referendum was the right thing to do. I think the campaign on both sides was not a strong campaign. It was full of reckless promises, undeliverable commitments to the British people, which are now coming home to roost. And that's what we're having to unpick. And that's what we've been unpicking over the subsequent 28 months. The Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister, Theresa May, has been honouring our commitment in that 2015 manifesto to deliver the result and to honour that result. And she's concluded this massive agreement, 585 pages of the withdrawal agreement, 26 pages of rather high-level waffle in the political declaration, and that constitutes the deal on which, as you said in your introduction, Parliament is going to vote in just over a fortnight's time.
And you have, if I may stop you just for a sec, you have sat in government with important positions, higher education and transportation more recently. You've sat in a government which has tried to find a compromise, to deliver on the result of the referendum, to get Britain out of the European Union, but in a way that delivers as frictionless an economic relationship with the EU as possible. And it seems to me that, with all of its pluses and minuses, is what Theresa May has come up with.
Well, we have a deal now. It's the product of 2.5 years of negotiation, but in my mind, it's the worst of all worlds. It really is hopeless, and it was for that reason that I took the decision that I could no longer stay in the government. Very difficult to reach.
You only took it at the sort of last minute of the last hour, because you've been sitting in government, watching Theresa May and her advisors move toward this deal for an awful long time, and you were supportive of it.
Precisely because I felt we had a duty to honour the referendum result. That's why I voted to start the Article 50 process back at the beginning of 2017. And then that's why I kept my peace within government and allowed the Prime Minister the greatest possible manoeuvre to reach a deal that was in the national interest. Now, it was only when the deal came back and we saw its emerging shape in the Chequers agreement over the summer, it was only when the deal came back and I could see that it was going to land us in the worst of all possible worlds, trapped in this subordinate relationship with the EU without any gains in sovereignty, but at massive economic cost, the very opposite of what was promised, that I realised I could no longer be part of it and I could no longer support it.
Theresa May's letter to the nation says this: "We will," she says, "as a result of my deal, the one she's negotiated after so much effort, we will take back control of our borders by putting an end to free movement of people once and for all. We will take back control of our money, ending the vast annual payments to the EU. We will take back control of our laws, ending the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice in the UK." Those are three fundamental pillars she is delivering.
Well, I strongly disagree. I think the Brexit as billed is not being delivered. We are not gaining control of our trade policy. The EU will continue to set our framework for trade because we'll be within the single customs territory. So as President Trump said this morning, this is a good deal for the EU, but it's not going to facilitate UK trade deals with countries outside of the EU, such as the US.
Well, with respect, you don't know that, because you don't know the future trade relationship that will ultimately be negotiated in the second phase of this between Britain and the European Union. So you don't know how free Britain will be to negotiate free trade deals with other third-party countries.
Well, there are some basic realities here, which is the EU is a market that's 5 times the size of the UK market. We're going to need to negotiate access to that market, and part of the whole package of our future relationship that's foreshadowed in the political declaration is that the provision for our membership of the single customs territory is going to be at the very heart of it. So the EU is going to shape our trade policy, and that's why President Trump is essentially right. It's not going to be possible for us to craft meaningful trade deals with third countries such as the US.
For those people who don't follow the ins and outs of British politics every single day, some will not know that you were an ardent Remainer. Now, surely underpinning your position today is the fact that you believe leaving the European Union is a terrible decision for Britain in any case. And what you have chosen to do at the 11th, well, the last minute of the last hour of this process is actually act upon your fundamental instinct, which is to try to block Brexit happening at all.
Well, I wanted the PM to bring back a great deal that was in the national interest, and I suspended disbelief for the last 2.5 years that she might do so. In reality, we saw in the summer as the Chequers proposals emerged, and then with this final deal that's come out of Brussels more recently, that we are going to be trapped in the worst of all possible worlds, and I don't want to be party to that.
A point, I mentioned politicking and poisonous atmospheres in my introduction. Just a point of interest to me, but also of political principle. When the Chequers deal was sort of created in the summer, your brother, who obviously was a very senior figure in the government, the Foreign Secretary, after 2 days of consideration, he flounced out of the government. He quit, making a very big noise, saying it represented what he called a suicide vest wrapped around the body of the British body politic. You, at the time, were still not in the cabinet, but still a senior minister. You didn't say a word. You didn't say anything. Why not?
Well, at that point, the negotiations with the EU were still ongoing, and I didn't want to do anything that would limit the Prime Minister's freedom of manoeuvre. So I didn't want to be accused of tying her hands and weakening our negotiating position in Brussels. That's why I kept my peace until she'd actually reached an agreement, pretty much. And so it was at that point that I felt that I'd done my duty. I'd allowed her maximum space to negotiate a deal, but I concluded it wasn't going to be in our national interest. It's going to leave us poorer and less in control than we were before. It's utterly pointless.
But it's not going to leave us poorer than leaving the European Union with no deal whatsoever, is it?
No, that's true, but that's not the relevant benchmark.
Well, it may well be the very relevant benchmark, because to many people's minds, including constitutionalists and political observers, if Theresa May does not win a majority for this deal in the House of Commons, the ultimate direction of travel is to a no deal, some call it a crash-out Brexit, on March 29th, 2019.
But that's precisely the false choice which the government is presenting to MPs and to the country as a whole, which I'm rejecting. Of course we have other options. That's why I feel it's important that we actually give the people a chance to now say whether they want to proceed with Brexit. Now that we actually know what Brexit is, it's not the idealised
position to take.
No, not at all. It's not the idealised.
You're ignoring everything that is happening around you. For example, Jean-Claude Juncker, the president of the European Commission, is saying this is the best deal Britain can get. In fact, it is the only deal that the EU will consider giving to the UK. And if it doesn't take it, the clear implication is there'll be no renegotiation. There'll be no further negotiation. This is it.
But I'm not suggesting a renegotiation of the text. I think the Prime Minister has probably got the best deal that Britain could get under the circumstances. What I'm saying is, now that we know what the concrete reality of a negotiated Brexit is, that we go back to the people and say, you wanted Brexit, this is the negotiated Brexit which the Prime Minister has delivered. It is the only Brexit that's negotiable, that's on the table. Now over to you. If you want it, this is it. If you don't want it, there is an opportunity to reconsider that decision.
Are you a gambler? I mean, instinctively, as a person, are you a risk taker and a gambler?
Look, I think it's important to be entrepreneurial in life. I support people who take risks and put themselves on the line for things. And if you want to stand by your convictions in politics, sometimes you have to do that.
Because this is the most extraordinary risk that you are suggesting the whole nation take. And it's a risk that, if it goes wrong, is going to cost the nation enormously. Is there not an arrogance in you demanding the nation take that sort of risk?
Listen, I'm just a backbench MP putting their views out. It's for other members of Parliament and the country as a whole to determine whether they want to take any notice of me. All I'm saying is we now know what Brexit looks like because the Prime Minister and the government have spent 2.5 years negotiating it. I think it would be a travesty of democracy to ignore the public, let alone what I think, ignore the public and say this is the Brexit you're going to get, like it or not. Because actually, when I look at my mailbag as a constituency MP, I see my residents in Orpington telling me they don't want this Brexit. Neither Remainers nor Leavers want this Brexit, and that's because it's the worst of all worlds.
Well, I want to come to your proposition, the referendum, in just a moment, but just to consider this idea of risk a little bit more. I mean, Theresa May said this in the Commons yesterday. She said, no one knows what will happen if this deal doesn't pass, but it will open the door to more division, more uncertainty, and all of the risk that will entail. You surely, whatever you think of her judgments in the last few weeks, you surely agree with that.
No, I think proceeding on this basis with a flawed, botched Brexit that leaves us in the worst of all worlds will leave everybody unhappy. Conservative Party will be blamed for bungling Brexit, for saddling the country with a half-in, half-out relationship that leaves us poorer and less in control than we were before. We won't be forgiven for that.
On the contrary, surely there's a message here that resonates with everything Churchill said about democracy, which, to sum it up and paraphrase it, was that it's the least worst system. It's not good, but it's better than all the other available systems. I think the profoundly
conservative approach to things is to leave things as they are if you don't have a better solution. We don't have a better solution than the arrangements we currently enjoy within the EU, and that's what I think we should put back to the British people. We say we've got the negotiated Brexit the Prime Minister secured. You either want that, or you stay in the EU, or you crash out altogether with no deal at all.
OK, so let's really unpick then this proposition of a second referendum. Let us go back to the beginning. You're the man who wrote the manifesto which said that the Conservative Party promises the British people an in-out referendum which will settle the matter of Britain and Europe once and for all. you're now the man who appears to be going back to the same public and saying, whatever I promised you before about an in-out referendum that would settle the matter was complete rubbish. I don't like the result we got, so we're going to do it all again. That's just not credible.
Well, it potentially will settle the matter. We put the deal that the Prime Minister has negotiated in full transparency back to the public. If they want to accept that deal, that's it.
But you've said that once already. You use up your credibility when you come back and say, oh, we're just going to do it again.
To a certain extent, but I think actually you've got to realise that the referendum that we had in June 2016 is not the same as the decision we would be asking the public to make now. We have before us 585 pages of a legal agreement plus a 26-page political declaration. This is the Brexit reality. If people want it, let's buy that, not the fantastical visions that were presented in June 2016.
Just in brief, there are a few specific mechanics here I don't understand. I mean, the British Parliament has passed an EU Withdrawal Act, and that and the EU's treaty says that, or at least the Article 50 rules say that we're leaving, absolutely categorically leaving, on March 29th, 2019. Now, I don't understand, least of all in timing, how you could get a referendum which requires parliamentary legislation and a very complex process to set it in train, how you could possibly get that done before the clock runs out on March 29th, 2019.
No, of course, you're right. You wouldn't get it done by the 29th of March 2019, and it would require the agreement of our European partners to suspend the Article 50 process or extend the Article 50 process to give us time, a few extra months, to hold that referendum. And in terms of the process, Parliament...
Just in parentheses, there is no majority in the British Parliament, as far as anyone can tell, to get any of that done.
At the time, as things stand today, that's probably true. I would concede that. But this is a very dynamic situation, and I think everyone will recognise that if the Prime Minister's deal is voted down in a couple of weeks' time, I think everybody in Parliament will be looking for a way through, and one of the most obvious ways through is a referendum that puts this question back to the British people.
Only, Joe Johnson, if you can answer the most basic question of all, what's the question on the paper, the ballot paper for this second referendum?
Well, ultimately, it will be MPs in Parliament who legislate and who craft the question.
But
and
you must have thought about it, because you're telling me this is the only way out.
And it won't be for me alone, but I'll come to that. It will come to that. Parliament will legislate. There will be extensive debates in Parliament. The Electoral Commission will test the question as legislation goes through the House of Commons. What I think is important for the question is that it doesn't disenfranchise strong groups within society, people who've got strong views for leave, strong views for remain, and strong views in support of the Prime Minister's deal.
You've already laid out three different territories there. So are you suggesting this won't be a binary referendum? I don't see how a non-binary referendum can work.
It's quite possible that it isn't a non-binary referendum, but I think what's relevant is that Parliament ultimately will determine the question on the advice given to it by the Electoral Commission.
If you would, frame for me, as you say, it's not your decision, it'll be a collective decision in the end, but frame for me, because you're an important player in this debate, frame for me a question that you think would work.
You're familiar with how we elect mayors in metro cities across the country, in London, Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool and so on. We use a system of a preferential vote with a first preference whereby you identify the candidate you want to be mayor most, and then you identify the person you could live with as the second choice. And progressively, as candidates are eliminated, those who give them their second preference votes are redistributed. It's a system of voting which we are now familiar with in at least 6 metro mayor elections across the country. It's a system which is well understood and which can easily be deployed in the event that Parliament decides there needs to be 3 options: remain, leave without a deal, or leave with the Prime Minister's deal that's been negotiated over the last 2.5 years.
What you've just outlined is complicated.
Well, it is if you want it to be. I don't think it has to be. We quite successfully elect mayors in London. We have done using this system on a number of occasions. We now have become more familiar in other parts of
London is one thing, but a decision which all agree, and we started with a quote from you, a very grandiose quote about historic decisions more important and more challenging than anything since Suez. I mean, we're not talking about electing the mayor of London or Manchester. We're talking about something that will shape Britain for the next 50, arguably 100 years.
I think you underestimate the ability of voters to determine determine what they want between complicated options. They quite easily manage to read party manifestos and make choices based on different parties' manifestos. They quite easily choose between candidates representing up to 10 different political parties. I think it's to undermine the ability of the electorate, or to underestimate the ability of the electorate.
A no-deal Brexit could damage the economy to the tune of 8% or more of GDP by 2030. You're rolling the dice, accepting that that is a part of your gamble.
Well, if MPs choose to put that particular scenario on the ballot paper, then ultimately...
Well, you said yourself it would have to be on the ballot paper to be fair to the public.
Ultimately, that would be one of the possible outcomes. I would obviously argue strongly against a no-deal outcome of that sort, and I'm sure the entire business community would as well. I can't believe there are many MPs in Parliament who would welcome that. But of course,
the point is you have an opportunity right now, if you and other MPs were to support Theresa May with her, what she would acknowledge as a compromise deal, you have the opportunity to absolutely be sure Britain will avoid that fate. But you're rolling the dice.
Well, look, I do think the Prime Minister's deal has extraordinary flaws. It will leave us poorer. It will leave us less in control. We won't get any of the advantages of Brexit in terms of an ability to do trade deals, an ability to turbocharge our economy and deregulate it and lower taxes and change all manner of standards, which was the Brexit vision. None of that is going to come to pass. And that's why I think it would be a travesty of democracy if we didn't go back to people and say, is this the Brexit you actually want?
In the 1840s, arguments over the Corn Laws, trade and tariffs, they destroyed the Conservative Party for an awful long time, decades. That is happening again. Your party is going to be destroyed over the next few weeks, isn't it?
Well, I think it's important that we come together. I think the party...
No, come on. People aren't coming together. You and your brother have fallen out completely over this.
My brother and I are in total agreement on the question of the need to reject this deal.
Absolutely, rejecting the deal, but from completely different ends of the perspective. Boris Johnson, former Foreign Secretary, he has called it, and I'm going to use his language, shameful capitulation and surrender, vassalage, colonisation, enslavement, a suicide vest around the body of Britain. That's his language from the point of view of an ardent, passionate Brexiter. You are now an ardent advocate of a referendum and a hope that people would vote to remain. You're at completely opposite ends of the spectrum in the same party.
But whether you're Remain or Leave, or whether you're a Remainer or a Brexiteer, all of us care about being in control of our lawmaking process. It's inherent in our democracy that you have to have the consent of the governed, and that's what we're really losing over the regulation of vast swathes of our economy with the Prime Minister's deal, and that's completely unsustainable and unacceptable for a democracy such as ours.
Surely what is unsustainable is the current state of the Conservative Party.
Well, look, I don't deny the party's divided. Who could? But the important thing is we don't do something because it's on the table. It's a bad option and we shouldn't accept it. We need to go back to the people, ask them to confirm that this is the Brexit that they actually want. And if it's not, then let's pause and give them the option to stay in the European Union.
In all honesty, what do you think this Brexit crisis has done, is doing, will do to Britain's political fabric?
Well, look, clearly it's a difficult time in politics. The opportunity cost of Brexit is enormous. We are wasting so much brain power across government, across the country, that could be better deployed solving the real causes of Brexit, our low productivity, our poor social mobility, our housing crisis, income inequalities. All these really fundamental issues that we should be tackling are not being addressed because the government is spending so much time and effort thinking about Brexit and mitigating the damage it's going to be doing to our economy and our society. So the wasted opportunity...
And you really think another referendum is going to solve that problem?
Yes, I do. I think if it gives us an opportunity to rethink this course, because believe me, if we accept the Prime Minister's deal, we are not suddenly going to stop talking about Brexit. We're going to be talking about how long do we stay in the transition period, on what basis do we extend it, on what terms do we go into any future trading relationship, for how long, with who. It's never going to stop.
Joe Johnson, we have to stop right there. But thank you very much for being on the Talk.
Thank you, Stephen. Good.